What if I told you that madness isn't the enemy of reason, but its inevitable collapse, the moment when the scaffolding of logic buckles beneath the unbearable weight of unspoken agony? That what we often label as insanity is not chaos, but clarity that the world refuses to accept. Imagine a mind not shattered, but exiled, banished from a society too uncomfortable to hold the rawness of pain without turning away. Now picture a boy, not a parable, not some poetic device, a real boy, flesh and blood, who once looked at life through eyes so wide, the sky itself must have felt like a playground. He didn't see the world as cruel or cold. He saw it as something enchanted, something humming with purpose. The wind wasn't just wind to him, it was a whisper. The night sky wasn't empty, it was asking questions. He touched the world with reverence, believed even silence had something to say. His name was Elijah. And he did not enter this life fractured. No, he entered whole. His heart beat like a drum of hope. His soul was untamed, innocent, and alive with wonder. But life has a way of punishing that kind of purity. It doesn't slash you all at once, it erodes you slowly, with quiet cruelty. Elijah was not born damaged. He was sculpted into a ghost of himself. Not through violence alone, but through omission. Through the moments when love should have spoken, but didn't. When comfort should have come, but never arrived. Every unanswered question, every neglected need, every quiet dismissal became an invisible chisel, carving into him, shaping him not into who he was, but into what the world made room for. And that's the most tragic part. He didn't become someone else because he wanted to, but because he had to. Because the world doesn't reward softness. It punishes it. And so piece by piece, his soul was filed down, not by drama, but by silence too sharp to survive. He grew up in a house where sound was never neutral, it either exploded or vanished. His father didn't speak so much as detonate. Every slammed door was a sentence. Every clenched fist, a full paragraph. The man's presence filled the room like a storm warning, loud, tense, impossible to ignore. His mother, by contrast, disappeared without ever leaving. She was there in body, but unreachable in spirit, drifting through rooms like a ghost trapped in her own silence. Elijah lived between extremes, violence and vacancy. He learned early that peace was never a given, only a pause between explosions. So he stopped hoping for calm. Instead, he listened, always. To tone, to footsteps, to breath patterns. His nervous system became his alarm system. His silence was not just coping, it was camouflage. At the dinner table, conversations were traps. One wrong word could trigger a landmine. Everyone smiled, but the tension was thick enough to cut. Emotions were masked with sarcasm, pain buried under sharp jokes. Truth was dangerous. Vulnerability was off limits. Apologies. They didn't exist. No one ever admitted when something was wrong. But Elijah's deepest wound wasn't the chaos, it was the gaslighting. The way everyone pretended it wasn't happening. The way the family posed for pictures, laughed at parties, and acted like home was fine. That denial became its own kind of violence. Because when no one names the pain, the child begins to doubt his own perception. He starts to wonder if he imagined the fear, if the ache in his chest is just weakness. And that confusion is soul deep. It doesn't just break trust, it unravels reality itself. This wasn't just emotional neglect. It was philosophical dislocation, what Carl Jung warned us about when he spoke of the soul's quiet collapse beneath the weight of lies. Elijah didn't just grow up afraid. He grew up unsure if his fear was even real. The body keeps secrets the mind can't handle. It records every moment the heart tries to bury. And Elijah's body remembered everything. Not in words, but in symptoms, in clenched jaws, shallow breaths, and that constant ache in his gut that no doctor could name. His nervous system carried the weight of 1,000 unshed tears. His sleep was never sleep, just an endless negotiation with nightmares that spoke in symbols. Insomnia wrapped around him like a shadow he couldn't outrun. He didn't recall his trauma like a timeline, he lived it, unconsciously, in every moment. It was a rhythm embedded in his bones. His trauma was not something that happened, it was something he became. So he did what wounded children do best, he adapted. He didn't wait to be understood. He became what people wanted. He studied their expectations and folded himself into them, over and over, until he no longer recognized his original shape. He learned to be magnetic, the kind of presence that made others feel seen, even as he faded further into invisibility himself. He cracked jokes. He gave good advice. He smiled when he wanted to disappear. Elijah became a mirror, reflecting other people's desires while his own identity withered quietly behind the glass. And within him was a cathedral, once vibrant with song and spirit, now hollow, cold, echoing with the silent prayers of a child who had long stopped expecting an answer. That's the secret tragedy of unhealed wounds. They don't explode. They erode. They disassemble the self piece by piece, so slowly that you mistake the collapse for personality. Elijah didn't just carry pain. He carried inheritance, grief passed down like family heirlooms, unlived dreams woven into his DNA. He bore the silence of generations, the emotional debts of parents who never paid their own. His sadness wasn't just his, it was ancestral, ancient, echoing through him like unfinished sentences. Carl Jung once warned that the heaviest thing a child can inherit is the parent's unlived life. Elijah carried it all. Not in his hands, but in his nervous system, in his instincts, in the very way he breathed. It was stitched into his being like ghost threads pulling at his soul, tighter with every year he pretended he was fine. And then, quietly, came the unraveling. Not in flames or breakdowns, but in slow, suffocating whispers. It was the kind of undoing that creeps in like fog, barely noticeable until you're drowning in it. His insomnia stopped being occasional, it became ritual. The nights stretched longer, more distorted. He began noticing everything, too much. The flicker in someone's eyes, the pause before a reply, the way a friend looked at their phone instead of him. It all felt loaded, like codes he was supposed to decode. Hypervigilance became his default state. Suspicion followed. Then came the paranoia, not loud or wild, but quiet and corrosive. He didn't distrust people because of hatred. He distrusted them because hope had betrayed him too many times. Trust, to Elijah, felt like placing your heart on a plate and handing it to someone with a history of breaking things. He wanted to be loved, but love felt like a setup. Too fragile. Too dangerous. So he began to do what trauma had trained him to do, push and pull. He pushed people away out of fear, then panicked at their absence and pulled them back. It wasn't manipulation, it was desperation. He didn't want them to leave, but he couldn't believe they'd stay. Every relationship became a reenactment of old wounds, a haunted theater where he kept trying to rewrite the past with new actors. And like all doomed scripts, it ended the same way, abandonment. Or worse, self-sabotage. He went to therapy, once. Walked into the room holding his pain like a secret he wasn't sure he should share. He said he felt hollow, like he was watching his life from behind a thick pane of glass. That sometimes he'd stare into mirrors, searching for someone familiar, only to find a stranger with his face. That his dreams bled into his waking hours, making everything feel unreal. The therapist called it depression. Anxiety. Gave him pamphlets. Offered coping strategies. But Elijah didn't need strategies, he needed a language to scream in. He needed someone to name the storm inside him for what it was, a soul rebellion. A revolt against years of swallowing pain so that others wouldn't feel discomfort. What he felt wasn't a glitch in brain chemistry, it was a protest. A scream from the parts of him that had been silenced for too long. And the silence began to rupture. He spoke to himself, at first softly, then in spirals of argument. His notebooks turned into graveyards of fragmented thoughts. Pages filled with mantras, scrawled over and over, "I didn't deserve this." Over and over. Not for comfort, but to remember. To anchor himself. His friends noticed the shift. They said he was different. Moodier. Distant. But Elijah wasn't changing, he was shedding. peeling away the layers he wore to survive. And beneath it all was someone raw, someone furious, someone still begging to be seen. That's the true face of madness, not chaos, not rage, but fatigue. The exhaustion of always pretending to be fine. Madness isn't a breakdown. It's a breaking open. It's not losing control. It's finally releasing the grip on a mask you were never meant to wear. Elijah wasn't falling apart, he was finally, painfully, becoming real. Philosophy has long danced with the concept of madness. From Socrates' musings on the soul, to Nietzsche's cries of eternal struggle, to Foucault's dissection of the mind's prison. But Elijah didn't need a book of theories or a dissertation on mental illness. What he needed was someone to whisper in his ear that the mind isn't just a machine. It's a delicate cosmos, an intricate universe of thoughts, memories, pain, beliefs, and meaning. And when enough of those stars go dark, the map you once had to navigate life becomes useless. You lose your way in the vastness of your own mind. Elijah didn't see the world the way others did anymore. He saw patterns, connections, signs everywhere. The flicker of a streetlight became coded language. A random billboard's advertisement felt like a personal message. The universe wasn't speaking in metaphors anymore, it was screaming, sending him encrypted messages only he could understand. Or so he believed. But this wasn't madness, not in the traditional sense. It was something far more insidious, meaning starvation. His mind, starved of clarity, began to build its own narrative. When the mind is denied a coherent, safe story to live in, it creates its own mythology, desperate to impose order on the chaos. This is what unprocessed trauma does. It doesn't fade or dissolve. It grows. It becomes an entity in its own right. It wears many faces: anxiety, addiction, intrusive insights, mystical delusions. It disguises itself as all these things, but at its core, it is still the ghost of something buried deep within, a child, abandoned and begging to be seen, acknowledged, loved. And that's the bitter irony of it all. By the time the trauma finally forces its way to the surface, the person often feels irreparably lost. The wounds are so deeply hidden in the shadows that the self feels fractured, unrecognizable. Elijah wasn't weak. He wasn't a failure. He was strong for too long. He had carried this weight, this endless war inside, without ever giving in. He had built walls around himself that were so thick, they could have stopped bullets. But nothing lasts forever. Even the strongest armor rusts, and eventually, the cracks begin to show. His unraveling wasn't a defeat. It was an act of resistance. A rebellion of the soul that had been silenced for too long. A protest against the years of suppression, a revolt against the roles he was forced to play. It wasn't madness, it was the birth of truth. A philosophy forged in pain. Jung didn't call this madness. He called it individuation, a term born from the depths of the psyche, a descent into the shadow self, a confrontation with the parts of us we are too afraid to face. It's the underworld of the mind, where false identities crumble, and the buried self begins to stir, to rise. In this process, you don't lose yourself, you find the version of you that was buried in the rubble of unspoken grief, in the chaos of unhealed wounds. This is the journey Elijah was on. The one no one could see, but the one that would eventually set him free. But the process wasn't poetic, it was brutal. Elijah wasn't having a spiritual awakening. He was drowning. He felt like he was being dragged beneath the surface of his mind by ancient hands made of memory and grief. He didn't hear voices, he heard echoes of moments he was never allowed to grieve. He didn't see demons, he saw the truth, raw, unfiltered, and unforgiving. That's the thing about collapse, it doesn't scream at first. It whispers. It waits. And then one day, everything fractures. Not because you snapped, but because no one heard you when you whispered. When you bury pain, you don't bury it alone. You bury a part of yourself with it. And ghosts don't rest. They haunt. He started writing again. Not for clarity, not even for healing. Just to let it bleed. Chaos spilled onto paper. Repetition, symbols, screams. I didn't deserve this. And that sentence wasn't closure, it was permission. To be angry, to grieve, to feel. And from that pain, something unexpected stirred, hope. Not the glittery kind. The kind that says, maybe you're not crazy. Maybe you're finally becoming honest. Because healing doesn't start with self-improvement. It starts with truth. And truth doesn't smile, it screams. Elijah began therapy again. This time, he didn't try to impress. He didn't perform. He just wept. For the child who was never protected. For the men who never felt safe. For the chaos that finally made sense when he stopped pretending. He wasn't healed, but he wasn't hiding anymore. He saw that what we call madness is often the mind's way of breaking through layers of survival to reach the real. And when he finally faced the parts of himself he'd locked away, they didn't punish him. They welcomed him back. If you've ever felt like the world is too loud, and you're too broken, let me offer you this: you're not broken. You're buried. You're the silence that was never heard. And healing isn't transformation, it's remembrance. It's recovering the parts of yourself that were exiled when the world told you to perform instead of feel. How do you start? Start with silence. Not numbness, but sacred listening. Walk. Write. Cry. Read. Not to escape, but to reconnect. Read not to diagnose yourself, but to remember you are not alone. Books like The Body Keeps the Score, Owning Your Own Shadow, The Drama of the Gifted Child, Man and His Symbols, they're not just texts. They're keys. Not answers, but invitations. And above all, don't heal to be acceptable. Heal to be real. To look in the mirror one day, not and see perfection, but to finally recognize the person staring back. The world doesn't need more people who pretend. It needs more people who have stared into the abyss and returned holding the pieces of themselves like sacred relics. Because the shadow is not your enemy. It's your teacher. And madness is just the soul's last attempt to be heard.